There is a conversation many leaders can feel forming in the back of the room. The kind of conversation no one schedules, because the moment you say it out loud, something changes. Not because leaders are ignorant. Not because they are incompetent. Not even because they are cruel. They hesitate because honesty has downstream consequences. Especially when the truth destabilizes the story that keeps people calm. And the truth is not subtle. Artificial intelligence is going to erase entire categories of work. Not as a distant possibility. Not as an abstract idea. It is happening now. In measurable ways. In the ordinary rhythm of organizations, in small process decisions, in efficiency initiatives, that sound harmless until you understand what's being replaced. The most dangerous element is not the existence of technological progress. Civilization is built on that. The danger is the collective performance of denial. The public posture that this transition will be incremental, manageable, and psychologically painless. Because the moment a leader admits what is coming, they inherit something they can no longer outsource. Responsibility to prepare people. Responsibility to retrain people. Responsibility to stop selling reassurance as if it were strategy. And, more quietly, responsibility to lead people through uncertainty without manipulating them. I suspect history will find this period strange. Not because AI appeared, but because so many institutions could see the wave, could measure the rising water, and still behaved as though the shoreline was permanent. That's where the real story is, not in the technology, but in the leadership psychology around it. Inside many industries, there is a private kind of panic. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like overwork. Sometimes it looks like cynicism. Sometimes it looks like people obsessing over being indispensable, which is one of the most revealing phrases in modern organizational life. There are people sitting at desks right now who are beginning to understand that their profession may not exist in any recognizable form within the next decade. Some understand it clearly. Others feel it the way you feel a structural vibration in a building before anyone confirms there's an earthquake. Writers, designers, analysts, administrative roles, customer support, entry-level corporate tracks that used to function as the beginning of a stable identity, transportation, logistics, and yes, even parts of medicine and law, because what's being automated is not only labor, but pattern recognition, documentation, triage, and routine judgment. The psychologically interesting part is how quiet this is in public. The silence is not evidence of safety. The silence is evidence of fear. Financial fear, obviously. People have mortgages. People have families. But also social fear. The fear of being the first person to say, "I think this might be ending," and being treated like a pessimist, or worse, like someone who is disloyal. And beneath that, there is existential fear. Most people do not simply work jobs. They build a self around usefulness. Around being competent. Around being the person others rely on. Routine becomes psychological scaffolding. Professional mastery becomes identity. So when automation threatens employment, it doesn't only threaten income. It threatens the architecture of the self. And I don't think society has fully metabolized what that means. This is not merely an economic transition. It is a psychological transition. And psychological transitions are rarely orderly when they are denied for too long. This brings us to the failure pattern that's becoming harder to ignore. A large portion of modern leadership has been trained into a narrow frame: quarterly performance, short-term optimization, margins, efficiency, speed, scalability. Those are not irrelevant. But when they become the entire moral vocabulary of leadership, something happens. Leadership turns into extraction. Output is maximized, and people are treated as inputs whose meaning doesn't matter, as long as the numbers work. True leadership has always been something else. It is not merely producing results. It is preparing human beings for reality before reality arrives unannounced and breaks them. And many institutions are failing that responsibility. Because the difficult truths are being postponed. Executives already see workflow compression. They see an entire layer of tasks collapsing into automated systems. They see departments shrinking without needing to name it publicly. They see the changing math of headcount. They see the reduction in entry-level opportunity, the subtle shift where the ladder begins higher off the ground. And yet, many employees are still being managed psychologically as though stability is guaranteed. That is not leadership. That is delay. It is the decision to let people keep walking toward a weakening structure because telling them would create discomfort today. If you know a bridge has damage, you don't wait until people are halfway across to mention it. You tell them early. Not to terrify them. To give them time. Time to pivot. Time to adapt. Time to grieve what's ending. Because adaptation is not only technical. It requires psychological runway. And without that runway, people don't adjust. They crash. One of the most persistent cultural mistakes is reducing unemployment to statistics, as if the experience can be summarized by a percentage. Unemployment is not only economic. It becomes emotional fragmentation. It becomes the loss of routine, which sounds small until you understand how much mental stability routine provides. It becomes the loss of confidence. It becomes social status erosion. It becomes the collapse of future orientation, which is one of the most dangerous psychological states a society can produce at scale. Now consider what happens when that experience is not isolated, but synchronized. What happens when millions of people begin to feel economically unnecessary? What happens when entire generations stop trusting the idea of a long-term career pathway? What happens when educational systems keep preparing people for roles that are already evaporating, because institutions tend to train for the world that existed when the curriculum was designed? These are no longer abstract questions. They are leadership questions. They are government questions. They are corporate questions. They are civilizational questions. Because if a society is not psychologically prepared for mass transition, what follows is not a clean spreadsheet adjustment. What follows is instability. History has been consistent about this. Large populations experiencing displacement tend to generate political volatility, social anger, ideological extremism, suspicion of institutions, emotional reactivity that begins to shape everything from voting patterns to community cohesion. Human beings require purpose. And for many, work has not merely provided income, it has provided a framework for existence. So when professions disappear, the secondary crisis is meaning. And meaning crises do not stay private. They leak into everything. There is a reason honest leadership is rare. Honesty produces immediate discomfort. It forces confrontation with a reality people are not emotionally prepared to integrate. To tell someone, "This industry may not protect you forever," is to interrupt their security narrative. To tell employees, "You should be building alternative skills now," is to admit that loyalty alone will not save them. To tell the public, "We are behind where we should be," is to invite criticism, fear, and sometimes panic. But leadership was never meant to be comfort management. Leadership is responsibility management. And responsibility, at times, requires saying what people would rather not hear yet. There is a repeating historical pattern here. Avoiding difficult conversations creates larger suffering later. A little reassurance now. Deep damage later. That formula shows up in families, in organizations, in governments. And AI is exposing something uncomfortable about modern leadership culture. Many people want the privileges of authority without the burden of moral honesty. They want to be rewarded for the appearance of stability, even when stability is no longer the true condition. But the leaders history remembers differently are often the ones willing to speak before the consensus becomes safe. Before honesty becomes fashionable. Before the truth can be blamed on inevitability rather than acknowledged as something that was visible in advance. It matters to say this clearly. I don't think AI is evil. It is, in many ways, inevitable. Human history is a sequence of disruptive technologies, each one reorganizing labor, identity, and power. But inevitability does not remove responsibility. If anything, it intensifies it. The transition era matters more than the technology itself. How people are prepared matters. How governments buffer displacement matters. How companies retrain instead of simply replacing matters. How educational systems evolve matters. And how honestly leaders communicate matters, perhaps more than any technical detail. Because populations can endure painful transitions when they believe the truth is being spoken and the sacrifice is being shared. But transitions without trust don't remain transitions. They become chaos. This is why leadership in the AI era will be less about charisma and more about courage. Courage to prepare people early. Courage to absorb the discomfort of telling the truth before you are forced to. Courage to sacrifice short-term calm for long-term survival. Not optics. Not branding. Responsibility. And responsibility is always heavier than it looks from the outside. Artificial intelligence is not merely changing industries. It is changing the psychological relationship human beings have with work itself. It is forcing a confrontation with questions people avoided when the world still offered predictable ladders. What am I, if what I do is no longer needed? What is my place, if competence is no longer scarce? What happens to dignity when usefulness is automated? Whether society stabilizes or fractures during this period may depend less on the algorithms than on the honesty. Because the future does not arrive all at once. It arrives quietly. A small workflow change. A tool that removes a task. A team that doesn't get replaced after attrition. Fewer entry-level openings. Automation that is not announced as replacement, but introduced as support. Invisibility is part of the process. And by the time the average person can name what is happening, the transition is already underway. So the question is not whether change is coming. The question is whether leadership will meet it with truth early enough to matter. This is the Magnificent Ones podcast.